All right, everyone. In the next few videos here, we are going to be attempting to make some sense of the mental. Okay. Now, and in particular, we're going to be focusing on attempts to explain mental phenomena or explain the mind in terms of physical phenomena. So what if, when we're talking about the mind, we really just are talking about something or some things that are actually physical. Okay. Now, in this video in particular, we're going to be focusing on the problem of mind-body interaction. Okay. Now, and who exactly is the mind-body interaction problem a problem for? Well, one individual that comes up quite a bit is Rene Descartes. So Rene Descartes' understanding is known as interactionist substance dualism. So it's dualist as the term denotes. So Rene Descartes thought that, well, the mind is one kind of substance, one kind of thing, and the body is another kind of substance, another kind of thing. And nevertheless, the mind and the body causally interact. So Descartes thinks that it's possible for the mind, as an immaterial, non-physical substance, to bring about effects in the body, which is a physical substance. And it's also possible for the body, as a physical substance, to bring about changes in the mind, which is an immaterial, non-physical substance. And even many of Descartes' contemporaries, his interlocutors, and we have, the letters that he's writing with individuals that bear this out, sort of said, okay, well, it seems what you need to do is either spiritualize the body to give an account of this, or you need to physicalize the mind. Okay, so if you're an interactionist substance dualist of any kind, how exactly an immaterial substance and a physical substance interact with each other causally is going to be a pressing concern. Now, but more generally, if you're going to say that there's some interaction between physical events and mental events, regardless of talk about substance. If you're just limiting your conversation to interaction between physical events and mental events, there's still a problem here. So, what does it mean for a mental event to cause a physical event? Okay. And we can talk about mental events and physical events without necessarily bringing up talk of substances, where the mind is one kind of thing and the body is a completely different kind of thing. Okay. Now, so um, whether or not this is a problem for certain property dualists, that really depends upon the kind of property dualist that you are. Okay, so many property dualists will say, okay, well, we are physical substances, so you and I are just physical things, but we nevertheless have irreducible mental properties. So we have physical properties and we have mental properties, but the mental properties are not reducible or are fully explained in terms of the physical properties. So you and I could be physical substances which nevertheless have irreducible mental properties. Now, but how might a substance dualist try to give an account for this? Well, it seems clear that only physical objects can have physical properties. Only physical substances can have physical properties. So if I know that something is 5 feet tall, if I know that something weighs 10 pounds, if I know that something is soluble in water, these are all physical properties. So knowing that something has at least one physical property means that it's a physical thing, it's a physical substance. Okay, well, a mind body dualist, a substance dualist might say, okay, well, but if we admit a difference in properties, if we admit that there's a difference between physical properties and mental properties, well, if only physical substances can have physical properties, then perhaps only mental substances can have mental properties. Now, logically, that doesn't follow. So you can't say only physical substances can have physical properties, therefore only mental substances can have mental properties. So that doesn't immediately follow, but you could try to fill in the gap here with some kind of argument. So where a property dualist and a substance dualist might find grounds to disagree is on whether it is possible for physical substances to have irreducible mental properties. So a lot of property dualists say, no, we're physical, but we have both physical and mental properties. A substance dualist, on the other hand, who wants there, to be a difference in kind between the mind and the body, might want to establish some kind of link and say, well, the body as physical, only bodies can have physical properties, or only things that are physical can have physical properties, and only minds, non-physical, immaterial minds can have mental properties. Okay. Now, but when we're talking about interaction, what kind of interaction is there? Well, first we have physical to mental causal interaction, where a physical state can produce a corresponding mental state, or a physical event can produce a physical event. Or if you're a mind-body dualist, a change in a physical substance can produce a change in an immaterial substance. Now, the idea that there's physical to mental causation hasn't really been all that controversial in the history of Western philosophy, unless, of course, you're George Berkeley, who's an idealist. So Berkeley thought, no, there is no such thing as physical to mental causation. Why? Because physical things don't exist at all. The only kind of causation there is mental to mental causation, because everything that exists is either a mind or a mental event or a mental state that exists within a mind. All right. Now, we won't talk about Berkeley here. We'll talk about Berkeley later, right? But so an example would be, I stub my toe, and I'm conscious, and I'm immediately aware of pain states in my body. So the awareness I have of pain states, which are being realized in a certain subregion of my body, in this case, my toe, my awareness of my own pain states, that is a mental state that I am in. So the mental states that you're in concerning your own pain states, your pain states, which are themselves mental states, um, aren't reducible, it seems, to just mere physical trauma. Why? Because you can have the presence of physical trauma without having a corresponding pain state, mentally speaking. So, if you're ever under heavy anesthesia or even localized anesthesia when you're having some kind of surgery, there's literal physical trauma being done to your body, right? But you don't experience any pain. Well, the reason why you're not experiencing any pain is because there's some sort of blocker here, whether it's a nerve blocker, some sort of consciousness blocker if you're under heavy anesthesia. Now, you feel the pain when you're in recovery, but that's just lasting pain from past physical trauma, right? Now, the pain that you would feel in recovery is different from the kind of pain that you would have felt, while you were being, while the operation was being performed on you. So while your body's being cut open by a scalpel, that would have been a different kind of pain than the recovery pain. So the recovery pain is due to physical trauma, but at the time that the physical trauma was happening to your body, you had no corresponding pain states, right? And it's precisely because, mentally speaking, you're not consciously there to be aware of the physical trauma that's, being realized in your body. You are later when you're in recovery. Okay. So that's physical to mental causation. Now, what about this? This notion of mental to physical causation. Okay. Well, when I'm sad, sometimes this strange thing happens. I have emotional feelings of sadness, which are mental states, and it results in a given physical behavior and physical manifestation. I leak saline out of my eyeballs. Well, more specifically, I leak saline out of my tear ducts. And sometimes I get the little breathy hiccup kind of thing. Sometimes I wail. Sometimes my body shakes because I'm so upset, right? So, because of a given emotional state that I am in, it produces certain kinds of physical behaviors and it produces certain kinds of physical manifestations. If I'm angry, my cheeks will turn red. The top of my head will turn red sometimes. My eye might twitch, right? So my anger is a mental state that I am in, but it has a physical manifestation to it. Or sometimes when I'm hungry, I make myself food and I eat it. Um, Sometimes when I want to raise my right arm, my right arm goes up, and then other times I want to raise my left arm and my left arm goes up, right? So, I mean, all of these kinds of things do seem to involve some kind of mental to physical causation. So it does seem to be the case that if I didn't want to raise my arm would not just go up on its own. It seems to be the case that were it not for the fact that I were sad, I wouldn't be crying. Were it not for the fact that I was hungry, I wouldn't be making food and then eating the food, right? We refer to our mental states as partial explanations of our behavior quite often. So, why are you eating? Because I'm hungry. Why are you crying? Because I'm sad. Um, why did you raise your hand? Well, I raised my hand to prove a point in a lecture video, or I raised my hand because, oh, I raised my hand because I wanted to ask a question, whatever the case may be. Okay. So, how exactly do we account for those kinds of things? If there's some kind of distinction, some important distinction, rather than just a verbal distinction between the mental and the physical, how exactly do we account for that? Okay. Now, and what do I mean by a mere verbal distinction? Okay. So I can talk about Batman and I can talk about Bruce Wayne. So clearly there's a verbal distinction between talking about Batman and talking about Bruce Wayne. Okay. Why? Batman and Bruce Wayne, they're not only two different words, they're in this context, they're two completely different names. So Batman is one name, it's one kind of linguistic token. Bruce Wayne is a different linguistic token. But the object that Batman and Bruce Wayne refer to is one and the same object. Okay. Now, so if what we're talking about when we talk about the mental and what we're talking about when we talk about certain physical things, if our mental terms just refer to physical things, but we still use language of the mental and we verbally differentiate it from language of the physical, this would be a verbal distinction. But verbal distinctions don't give us metaphysical distinctions on their own. I mean, if they did, if having a verbal distinction were enough to give you a metaphysical distinction, then when I'm talking about Batman and when I'm talking about Bruce Wayne, I'm talking about two different individuals. Or when I'm talking about red, rojo, or rouge, I'm talking about three completely different colors. No, these are three linguistic tokens which all refer to the same phenomena, the color red in English. So likewise, Batman and Bruce Wayne refer to one and the same object, even though linguistically there's a verbal distinction here. Okay, so even if there is some sort of verbal distinction between the mental and the physical, it doesn't follow from that that there's any kind of metaphysical distinction between the mental and the physical. We're just using different words to talk about one and the same thing, whether it be a given event or a given phenomena. Okay. Now, so one particular argument here is known as the exclusion problem. All right. And the exclusion problem is meant to show that there is no mental to physical causation. Now, why is it exclusion? Well, the idea is that if we can give an account for all the physical events which act as causes, right? So if we can give an account of all the physical causes, we will eliminate or exclude the mental from any of these causes. So if we can give a full account of the physical causes, then there's not anything left over, if you will, for mental causes to explain. So if all causes are physical causes, meaning that there's nothing left over for mental causes to explain, then we exclude mental causes by default. And if we exclude mental causes by default, there really is no, metaphysically speaking, any distinction between mental causation and physical causation. Again, we might verbally make a distinction. We might talk about mental causes and physical causes as if there is some meaningful distinction between them. And there might even be a verbal distinction between them, but metaphysically, there's not going to be any distinction between these things. Okay. Okay. So here's the first thing we're going to do with this argument. First thing we're going to do is just assume that physical events can have mental causes, right? So we're going to assume that there can be mental causes for physical events. Okay. And then premise 2 is going to state that all physical events have themselves physical causes. So this is a principle known as the causal closure of the physical. So the physical domain, or for any given physical system, that physical system is causally closed. There's nothing non-physical kind of outside of the physical system interacting with the system. Now, physical systems can be open. So if we think of the Earth as a physical system, a certain kind of physical system, well, clearly the Earth is not a closed system. Why? We get energy from the sun. So if we limit the Earth as a system, if we talk about the Earth as itself a system, well, there's things outside of that localized system, interacting with it. So the energy that we have on the Earth comes from the sun. There are things, meteors and asteroids and things like that coming into our atmosphere and so on and so forth. So the Earth is not a closed system. Now, but if we wanted to talk about the totality of the physical, the big physical system, let's just call the big physical system the cosmos. The idea here is that the physical system is causally closed, or at the very least, for any physical system, there's no non-physical thing outside of that system interacting within that system, okay? Or all physical events have physical causes. Okay, now the third premise is going to take some parsing out here, and that is that events cannot be causally overdetermined. So the third premise says that it's not possible, if you want to get technical, it's not possible for any given event to be causally overdetermined. Now, what that means is that, if a given event A is sufficient to bring about another event B, right? Then if A and C both happen, it's not the case that A and C both together cause B. So if B would have happened on the occurrence of A, then it's not the case that A and C jointly cause B. Why? Because that would be overdetermined. Okay. Now, but why is this so problematic? Well, let me give you an example here. Okay, so since the weather's getting cooler outside, it's officially autumn now and everything. Halloween is coming up, my favorite holiday, Halloween, and you and I might find ourselves at a haunted house, not a real haunted house, but a fake one. So as we're walking through the haunted house, this happens. A scary witch holding up, this fake skull or whatever, kind of creepy looking, jumps out from behind a wall while you and I are walking down a hallway. Okay. Now, and so the witch jumps out on our left as we are walking down the hallway of this haunted house. And on the right jumps out this creepy pumpkin kind of skeleton. Okay. And let's just say that the witch and the creepy, scary pumpkin ghost, whatever, both jump out at the same time. Okay, so you and I are walking down the hallway of this haunted house, and simultaneously, this scary witch jumps out from the left, and then this scary pumpkin ghost thing jumps out on the right. And we scream, right? We both scream at the same time. So here, let's just talk about my scream. Okay, now, and what do we mean to say that something caused my scream? Well, so this is known as the kind of the counterfactual model of causation. Okay, according to the counterfactual model of causation, to say that A caused B means if A had not happened, B would not have happened. So that is a counterfactual. We're talking about what would have or would not have been the case if other things were the case. Okay, so A caused B. If A had not happened, B would not have happened. Right? So what is B? B is my scream. Right? So we're asking the question, what is it exactly that caused me to scream? So the witch jumps out on the left, the scary pumpkin jumps out on the right, and I scream, but they jump out simultaneously. So what is the cause of my scream? Okay, well, let's say for the moment that my scream is causally overdetermined, right? Now, that means I would have screamed regardless of who jumped out. So if the witch would have jumped out on their own, I would have screamed. If the scary ghost pumpkin would have jumped out, I would have screamed. But what actually happened? What actually happened is that they both jumped out at the same time. So the witch jumped out, the pumpkin jumped out, and I screamed. But let's just say that I would have screamed regardless of who jumped out. So if just the witch would have jumped out, I would have screamed. And if just the pumpkin would have jumped out, I would have screamed. Okay, now, but what does that mean? So on the assumption that my scream was causally overdetermined, what does that mean for this counterfactual analysis of causation? If the witch would not have jumped out, I wouldn't have screamed. Okay, but that claim is false, right? If the witch would not have jumped out, I would not have screamed. That is false. It is false that if the witch had not have jumped out, I wouldn't have screamed. Why? Because the pumpkin still would have jumped out, and I still would have screamed. Okay, now, but it's also true, if the pumpkin ghost had not jumped out, I wouldn't have screamed. That is also false, right? So it's false that if the witch would not have jumped out, or had not have jumped out, I wouldn't have screamed. It's also false that if the pumpkin had not jumped out, I wouldn't have screamed. Why? The witch jumping out is sufficient to cause me to scream. Pumpkin jumping out is sufficient to cause me to scream. But I want to say that my scream is causally overdetermined. Well, but if it's causally overdetermined, that means it's false that if the witch wouldn't have jumped out, I wouldn't have screamed. It means it's also false that if the pumpkin wouldn't have jumped out, I wouldn't have screamed. Now, but what that implies is that neither the witch nor the pumpkin ghost jumping out caused me to scream, right? Now, so what's the problem with causal overdetermination? The problem with causal overdetermination is this. If I'm going to say that A is sufficient to cause B, but also C is sufficient to cause B, but it's A and C causing B together, right? That's what it would take for an event to actually be causally overdetermined. Now, but if you admit the possibility of causal overdetermination, if you say, no, you know what, A is sufficient to cause B, C is sufficient to cause B, but it's actually A and C jointly causing B, even though the event is overdetermined. Well, it follows from that, so goes the argument, that neither A or B actually, or I'm sorry, neither A nor C actually cause B. So if you think that causal overdetermination is possible, and you also hold to a sort of a counterfactual analysis of causation, then those two things can join together. So the possibility of causal overdetermination and a counterfactual analysis of causation, it follows that no sufficient cause is actually a cause, right? So again, it's false that if just the witch had jumped out, I wouldn't have, or I'm sorry, it's false that if the witch would not have jumped out, I wouldn't have screamed. It's also false that if the pumpkin wouldn't have jumped out, I wouldn't have screamed. But those two things are supposed to be sufficient for me screaming, and yet they're both supposed to jointly cause my scream in a way that is causally overdetermined. Well, we can't have it both ways here. So the idea is, if the counterfactual analysis of causation is the correct one, and it's possible for events to be causally overdetermined, then it follows that no sufficient cause can cause any event, right? So the idea is that is an inconsistent set of claims, right? It's an inconsistent to hold to a counterfactual account of causation, to affirm the possibility of causal overdetermination, and also to affirm that every event has a sufficient cause. Those three things, so goes the argument, is an inconsistent set. Okay, so if it's possible for events to be causally overdetermined and the counterfactual analysis of causation is the correct one, that means that no event has a sufficient cause. So if you buy into causal overdetermination, the idea is you need to reject causation in the first place, and that just seems to be problematic. Okay? All right. Now, let's get back to the argument here. If events can have physical and mental causes, then events can be causally overdetermined. So if physical event A is enough to bring about physical event B, but also mental event M is sufficient to bring about B, then that means it's possible for events to be causally overdetermined. Now, but given what we have in premise 2, right, it means that 5 and 1 contradict. Okay? I'm missing a slide. Oh, I skipped it. There it is. So therefore, events can be causally overdetermined, right? So let's go back here since my slides got screwed up. So if events can have physical and mental causes, then events can be causally overdetermined. But given our assumption in premise 1, it follows that events can be causally overdetermined, right? Now, but 5 contradicts 1. 5 contradicts 1, so we can derive a contradiction from our initial assumption. Now, and since we can derive a contradiction from our initial assumption, we would then reject that assumption. It must then be false that physical events can have mental causes. Okay? So on the assumption that physical events can have mental causes, and given the premise that all physical events have physical causes, and given the premise that events cannot be causally overdetermined, it would follow that physical events cannot have mental causes after all. And if physical events cannot have mental causes, and all physical events are explained by physical causes, then the mental causes are excluded by default. Okay? Now, what are some of the options here? Well, you could reject a counterfactual analysis of causation. Some philosophers might do that. You might reject the idea that there's something problematic about causal overdetermination. Okay, why not just say, all right, even though A is sufficient for my, the witch jumping out is sufficient for my screaming, the scary ghost pumpkin jumping out is sufficient for my screaming, and yet my scream is jointly caused by both. Okay, what's so wrong with causal overdetermination? All right. Now, but it seems if you do think causal overdetermination is not problematic, it seems you do need to reject the counterfactual analysis of causation, as I've already indicated. Now, you could also reject the causal closure of the physical. You might just say no. The idea that the physical system, the cosmos, is causally closed, that is just false. There's non-physical causation within the physical system itself. Okay. Those are all options. Now, another option is this. You might just adopt some type of epiphenomenalism. Okay? So the epiphenomenalist is a form of property, or epiphenomenalism is a form of property dualism, which would hold that, yeah, mental events and states are irreducible to physical events, yet they don't cause anything. Mental states and events are causally inert. So mental states and events correspond pretty strongly to physical events and physical states and physical phenomena. But there's the mental never causes anything physical. On our end, it appears to. So my state of hunger accompanies physical states in my body which produce the action of me going to the kitchen and making food. So the epiphenomena, the mental state of hunger, is there, which is produced by the underlying physical cause. So the underlying physical cause, which moves me to get up and make food and eat it, also produces the mental event of hunger. And those two things run in close proximity to each other, that it appears to me as if one thing is causing the other thing. So there's a correlation here. There's a pretty strong correlation here, but there's no causation here. So there are underlying physical states in my body which produce a mental state of hunger, and those same underlying physical states in my body also produce the movement of my body going and making food and then feeding itself. But it appears to me, since I have directly aware of the epiphenomenal mental states, I have direct awareness of the epiphenomenal mental states, but I don't have sort of conscious direct awareness of the physical states of my body, producing the movement. I associate the movement with the epiphenomenal state of hunger, but that is just a mistake. So it appears to me as if my mental states are producing changes in my physical body, but it is underlying physical states in my body that are producing those states in my physical body, even though they pretty strongly correlate or correspond to these causally inert mental states that I possess. All right. Okay. So I apologize for the slides getting a little bit out of order there. That confused me a bit and threw me off guard, but I really don't want to start this video over again. So we'll just deal with it. All right. So hope you enjoyed this short lecture on problems of mind-body interaction, and I will see you next time when we talk about behaviorism, identity theory, and functionalism.